antivirus company. And something that we've noticed in the last 8 years is that strategy is fundamentally shifted to data center and cloud-centric models, and it's something we've progressed. We've also realized that your business models have changed as well, and we get a tremendous amount of feedback from not only public sector, but as well as commercial customers around what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis as far as infrastructure, security, and compliance, and ultimately we take that feedback very seriously and factor that into what we do. We've been around about 22 years, and we're a pure play security company. So when we're looking at cloud-based security, we know what we're doing, we know what we're talking about, and ultimately it's been through the trials and tribulations of working on that through our investments in time and money with our customers. A little bit of background about me before we kind of get going. I have been with TrendMicro since the beginning of the year, primarily focused on public sector technology and solutions, hence the title. Prior to TrendMicro, I've really spent 10 years, the last 10 years in public sector. The last 7 as VP of Technology for a company called NIC, that is a e-government service provider for 27 to 50.govs. So a Texas.gov, for example, would be an infrastructure that they offer up and deliver e-government services through. And ultimately that was a infrastructure as a service multi-tenant type model, where cloud security and PCI and Sarbanes-Oxley, as well as HIPAA and PII was a critical focus for us for protecting constituent data, as well as business data and citizen data overall. Prior to that, I worked for Honeywell Federal Manufacturing and Technologies out of Kansas City, and that was a Department of Energy contract focused on federal government type work, ultimately protecting the nuclear weapons complex and the stockpile. They manufacture 85% of the components in non-nuclear aspects of a nuclear weapon. So pretty much everything but the physics package. So was in various leadership positions there in both IT as well as manufacturing. So huge security implications there. So let's go ahead and get into it. One of the things that the abstract of the session talked about are what are the key considerations, and there are many. Okay, these are just a couple of things that as I've gone through this and implemented this myself, that I ran into and certainly had to plan out and design when it came to ultimately delivery models, working with public cloud type companies in a very, very shared services strategy, and ultimately the things that I looked at as we went through those particular journeys. And it's certainly the things that our customers are faced with today, whether they're evolving their strategy from a private cloud to a public cloud, and ultimately combining the two in a hybrid cloud model. So as we boil this thing down, I'll try to provide a little bit of context with each of the 5 when we go through, and then we'll get into what that ultimately means as you take this journey on. Continuous monitoring. This is something that's very, very focused right now within the federal government. And really what it means, and it's a similar analogy is, I don't know if anybody knows somebody, I'm sure you do, that has the need to monitor insulin from a perspective, right? You see a lot of capabilities to do continuous monitoring of blood sugar levels, things like that, to always have a constant awareness of what's going on within your blood system. The same holds true with your information security and your networks, right? You want to have a continuous presence of what's going on within all of your systems, and the federal government calls it continuous monitoring. It really stems from SOX and Sarbanes-Oxley from an auditing perspective, financial auditing. It's certainly transcended into information security and compute power, but always understanding what's going on, good or bad, meaning regular operations of pushing code, doing patches, to negative aspects of your adversaries are trying to gain information out of your network, exfiltrate data out of your network, or worse yet, maintain a persistence in your environment without you knowing, and continuing to have a foothold in your environment. That really has moved into continuous diagnostics and mitigation, all focused on risk-based scoring. So many of you are familiar with deploying and are participating in an information security management program. A risk-based scoring or a risk framework is a key component of that entire program. What we mean by that is you know what your critical assets are, you know what your critical data sets are. You have to evaluate that from a risk perspective, score that, and then react based on events that happen within your environment against those particular assets. So our environments are so big and there's so many things going on as far as operation and events that we have to find a way to be able to score those and filter those and basically filter out the noise that's going on within those environments so we can be better prepared when things actually happen within those environments. Self-defending workload. What we mean by that really is our focus is we don't care where the workload resides, and from a best practices standpoint, we are recommending to you all as prospects or existing customers to ultimately focus on defending the data, right? Our approach traditionally has been an outside-in security perimeter protection model. Well, that's still very, very important. We're not saying that it's not. But what we're also focusing on is the inside-out component, knowing your data, knowing where it resides, and then putting precautions and controls in place to protect that data, no matter where it goes from a virtual machine to virtual machine, or from your data center to a public cloud. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, if there has been a compromise, if that has moved outside your four walls, doing what you can to protect that data to make sure that that miscreant can't do anything to negatively impact that once they are able to obtain it. So self-defending workload is another key attribute you need to think about no matter what your phase or your stage of your journey is to the cloud. Service level agreements. This is just as important internally from agency to agency or municipality to municipality or agency to public service provider. Understanding what the terms and conditions are in the service level agreements, not just from uptime perspective, but what's going to happen in the event of a breach or an issue within your environment that I may not have control on. Really get the stakeholders involved from an operations perspective, infrastructure, security operations, and last but not least, and this is no disrespect to any lawyers in the room, you have to get legal involved when you're looking at these service level agreements. We're seeing agencies that are doing a good job as they're evolving into kind of a service provider model of creating boilerplate language in the form of service level agreements. And the larger service providers will have this as well. You really need to focus on what that language is saying and ask them the tough questions around not only about my uptime issues and the penalties associated with that, which is important, so availability, but also resiliency, okay? How are they going to be able to ensure that my data is secure and ultimately portable if they are declaring a certain level of uptime associated with that? But the last one and most important one is the level of liquidation, things like that, should they have a breach that impacts my environment, all right? And what are the associated penalties with that, and what are the really the incident response when that happens? That's another key component. So service level agreements are another key cog in this overall equation. The fourth bullet, or the fourth point, is what we call transient security. And that really gets into, no matter what environment you are in, being able to secure that asset, okay? Understanding the nature of that mixed workload with other environments and what that asset's trying to do with that role, and then being able to port that around, again, with all the security controls and protocols based on that asset categorization. I may have a particular server that processes sensitive information. I may have a particular server that just serves up media. Those two fundamentally may have different controls associated with them. I need to be able to have that stay with that particular instance no matter where it moves or where it resides. The other key component is interoperability. One of the things you have to be very, very careful of when you're looking at cloud providers, internally as well as externally, is your ability to interoperate within their environment and not have system lock-in. And what I mean by system lock-in is you need to be able to pick platforms that are standards-based approach, that you can incorporate similar things that you already do within your four walls, and then should the day come where that service level agreement gets to a point where you exercise it and there's termination issues, or you just have a new business model, you can get that data out, you can get those things and disentangle yourself from them because of the interoperability. Does everybody follow me with that? So look at those cloud providers that have defined interoperability standards, APIs, things of that nature that make it very easy to hook up and disentangle should you run into issues. Now there are a ton of other things to consider, and we're going to dive into some of the security aspects of it, more of a focused area. But these are the things that I think if you look at those aspects, you're going to be better prepared from a planning perspective and an overall longevity and journey to the cloud in a much more prepared and secured fashion if you think about these different things. We'll follow into some of the process components and maybe even later on talk about some of the technology aspects of it, but these are the things we wanted to get going with. So we've been surveying many different components of the marketplace over the last year. And really, we have this evolution we call a journey to the cloud, and it's really evolving from the physical paradigm that we've been dealing with and continue to deal with our internal environments, but then moving to a consolidation ratio with virtualization, and that could be with VMware, that could be with Hyper-V, that could be with Citrix, that could be with Red Hat. Ultimately, to figuring out where the cloud ecosystems fit in to further gain economies of scale from a cheap storage, cheap compute, cheap bandwidth perspective. Ultimately knowing that as that evolves, all three of those are going to continue to persist in our realms, all right? Most likely, you're still going to have physical systems that for whatever reason, because of legacy applications, things of that nature, that can't be virtualized. You're going to have physical systems that can't be virtualized and you can't put in a public service provider because of sensitive information. You're going to have virtual machines that are going to need to, based on seasonality or workload capability, need to move back and forth between your virtual environment and a public cloud provider. Those are all things that you're going to be looking at. And then lastly, you may just have services out there in the cloud that are very commoditized, and the element of which you secure those is still important, but it might not be at the same level of security that you have with the physical or inside your four walls virtual. Tie that all in with the challenges of being public sector and what we're supposed to do with this particular information, and the speed in which we're forced to move across these different ecosystems. Having the right tools, the right processes, and the right people that are skilled up to be able to do this is very, very important. So look at the phase here, right? Physical, pretty straightforward. As you get into virtual, people that are looking to do server virtualization and virtual desktops, okay, you're going to hear me say VDI, that's virtual desktop infrastructure. Those are the key areas in which people are trying to gain economies of scale for a couple of different reasons. One, we're starting to see that over the last probably 3 to 4 years, there hasn't been a lot of spending on capital expenditures, for the most part, right, due to budget constraints, things of that nature, for servers, as well as laptops and desktops. So as that starts to change and we see the need because of aging systems and saturated from a performance perspective and newer technologies, we're seeing people to move to consolidation ratios for both server virtualization as well as desktop virtualization. And on top of that, you get security and compliance benefits you don't get typically, or they're much harder to achieve when you are traditionally looking at a pure physical one-to-one type ratio. So huge cost savings there. So where are people here? 61% are doing some form of deployment or piloting in this arena for servers. You know, by and large, somebody in some shape or form, whether it's research and development or all the way to production. I think in 2006, I started the journey of putting production services into the environment with VMware tools. People are doing this in some capacity, okay? Virtual desktops, a little bit slower as far as adoption. Why? Because they're doing servers first, right? You have to kind of have that infrastructure in place, and it's a natural progression to go from servers to desktops with the virtualization effort. So what about cloud? This was pretty surprising to me. In the cloud world, 48%, again, and I would say using VMware or other virtualization technologies are the first phase of deploying really your own private cloud, right? You're starting to get into a lot more consolidation, elastic compute, and with the tools that VMware has out at this particular juncture, it's being it's much easier to be able to develop your own private cloud because of what they've created as the software-defined data center. If you haven't heard of that, that is a huge term that they are using that basically says, we've taken all the heavy lifting and done it for you and made it very, very simple for you to create your own software-defined data center using our tool sets and manage it without a tremendous amount of overhead or costs. So that's really the private cloud, and then 48% in the form of public cloud, which was pretty shocking. So there's some statistics around where people are, and I'll get into a little bit of fun hand raising here in a second on kind of where you guys are with your journey. So 2/3, or 2 out of 3, I should say, have some form of private or public cloud going on within their organizations. And really the emphasis of this is it takes a great deal of planning, just as you would do a particular IT project or deployment, whether it's a new application or an enterprise system or whatever. That takes planning on a project timeline. Just because you're going and can move quickly with a credit card to do something in the cloud doesn't mean it's going to be a very, very smooth transition. So you have to factor in a lot of planning time, a lot of architecture discussions, and a tremendous amount of what I would call stakeholder integration from the various people that are going to be part of this ultimate end solution. Because I will tell you, having lived this, if you don't get the right people at the table and you deploy, and you didn't give people a voice when it comes out, there's going to be challenges. No matter how rosy or how smooth the project seemed to roll out, there's going to be somebody that didn't feel like they were heard or had a stake in the game, and you're going to miss something. So it's not an exact science, but the more people and the more stakeholders you can get involved in this, the better. So where are you with the deployment? Quick little hand raising here. Which of the following have you deployed or started piloting? So server virtualization. This could be in the form of VMware, Hyper-V, Citrix, Red Hat. Who has started that journey of server virtualization? Okay, so almost half. So VDI, remember I referenced virtual desktop infrastructure. Is anybody, and I'm assuming this would be a natural progression of folks that have done server virtualization, how many of those in general have started a VDI related project? Okay, a little bit smaller number, okay? And you know, the interesting thing around virtual desktop infrastructure, there's studies around that they're saying that the cost differences initially, there's not a huge difference. A lot of people think that they get these huge economies of scale, one for one, from a physical laptop to a virtual desktop infrastructure. Well, it costs money to put all that infrastructure together, right? So really how you need to think about it is the cost savings initially come as you start to scale those VDIs on that infrastructure and start to see that payback in the form of streamlined security operations, less overhead from a desktop support perspective, compliance, all those things that if you dive into it, some of them are soft costs, but then the longer you persist in that VDI and really squelch out the legacy physical laptop, desktop environment, you'll start to see those gains and those returns on investment through a lot of those things I just mentioned. Private cloud, and I talked a little bit about what I thought, what I kind of define as a private cloud. Virtualization is one. Who's kind of doing that in this juncture that feels like they've kind of got their arms around a private cloud within their agency or city or whatever? Anybody kind of doing a private cloud?
Piloting.
No. What's that?
I said we're evaluating.
Perfect. Sorry. Thank you. That good emphasis on started piloting, so that would be another good one. Okay. Okay, excellent. Thanks for coming, because hopefully we can provide some insight on that. Public cloud. Anybody using a public cloud provider to do some form of computing or storage or some aspect? Okay. All right. We'll talk about the challenges of that in a little bit. I want to see if I can get some feedback from you all. And then, if we don't have many people doing the public cloud, I'm guessing fewer, if any, are going to be doing a hybrid. Anybody would be doing a hybrid cloud, which means you have some assets internally inside your four walls that have a secure conduit, hopefully secure, to the public cloud provider, and you're exchanging information in some capacity. It's some kind of service, right? Okay. All right. Good. So it's a target-rich environment to kind of walk through and talk through these things. So, excellent. So, where we are focused on, and where I think it's very important to understand, I found that it's very easy to get ahead of yourself when you start to virtualize server infrastructure, and when you start to go out and acquire assets in a public cloud, because once you get the infrastructure in place, it's really easy to move fast, okay? Sometimes at a rate and a cadence that you move too fast, and you don't think about the core things that you used to do in your other system and security development lifecycle that would tend to be factored into a project or a release cycle or a deployment schedule, right? Because it's so easy to go click, software defined, spin up, and get going. So when you look at the security implications of a release process like that, you have to find ways to embed that into the operation cycle or development life cycle to where it becomes almost innate. When those new instances spin up, they're protected by profiles and controls and server hardening or system hardening protocols that you would do as if you bought it from Dell, or if you bought it from CDW, or you bought it from HP, or if you bought it from Oracle. Okay, I gotta throw another California company in there. That's very, very important because we can often get mesmerized on how easy it is for our administrators to go, boom, there you go, Mr. Customer or Mr. Agency or Mrs. Agency Provider. You have a virtual machine. I've made it publicly available to you. Here's your login credentials. Well, if you don't have something working in the background to protect that, it can become very costly, and something's going to get missed. Something's going to get missed. So as we talk about the security aspects of it, look at this. We're going to see a 46% to 63% jump in the virtualization of servers coming. Okay, that's huge. That's huge. And desktops in the same, almost at the same rate. All right, that's a little bit lagging as far as the overall technology lifecycle adoption, if you will, but very, very important and very similar path or trajectory that we're seeing with server virtualization. With server virtualization, and as well as desktop virtualization, the fact that you're able to do this, like I said, very, very quickly, and also at a rate where your end users become accustomed to this dynamic, fluid nature of service delivery, whether that's, hey, I need 3 VMs because I'm doing this project, or I've got 2 new resources coming on, I need virtual machines or virtual desktops for them. There are different kinds of threats that come in through a virtualization world that may or may not be completely identical to what we're used to and accustomed with in a physical world, okay? This could really stem in the form of, how are those virtual machines going to react within that virtual ecosystem? How are they going to talk, or can they talk across virtual LANs, VLANs, or virtual switches? What does that communication and crosstalk look like, and what do I want to allow? Those are all key things that we have to focus on. And then the other key piece is, those are all competing for resources on said physical host, right? Somebody made a comment the other day that virtualization almost is like infinite resource capability, right? Well, until you hit a saturation point, I would agree with that, right? So the infinite doesn't become so infinite when you realize all the uses, the utilization on that particular physical box when you put too many virtual machines on there, or virtual machines that have multiple software packages that are competing for CPU cycles, and RAM, and disk, and network, right? That all stems from what's being used on that particular virtual server. As you layer those on, and you layer your security strategy on with that, there are key things that potentially could impact performance, and will impact performance, unless you give serious thought on how those things are planned and deployed, all right? One such example. Whether you're doing server virtualization or desktop virtualization, there are certainly some people that have interesting opinions around, do I need antivirus on those particular platforms? And if so, how do I deploy that? Well, we are firm believers that yes, you need antivirus on there, and yes, you need technologies that can go beyond antivirus. Well, how do you do that? If you go back to my comments around the self-defending workload, how do you do that in such a fashion that it's not going to cripple your virtualization or your cloud infrastructure when you start layering on those security protocols? AV is one of them. Well, if anybody knows, and whether it's your home PC or your work PC, depending on the horsepower you have, when your antivirus system kicks off and does full scans and does its thing, does that impact your box or your resource? It does, okay? A lot of the good leading software companies are making that much more streamlined and much more lean and mean, but take that traditional approach of your PC, which is not running on a shared infrastructure, or a server that's physical in nature, it only has its own resources to compete, that might not really feel a big hit if it's doing something off hours, things of that nature. Start to virtualize all that. When those are all competing on the same hardware with network and disk, CPU and RAM, and they're all kind of doing their thing, what's going to happen to that particular server resource? Or if it's a virtual desktop infrastructure, it's also going to impact the server resource. What's going to do is create these resource storms, right? Exponentially, the big economies of scale is you start to put more virtual machines on your physical host, right? One to many. The more you add on there, the more you put traditional ways of doing antivirus or other security protocols, the more you're going to start to bring those servers to their knees when all of them want to spin up and start doing their things. All right? You've got to find a different way. This is not going to scale anymore. It's not going to scale anymore. So the 3 a.m. scan is typically something that is done off hours. What we're seeing with VDIs is I may come in the next morning at 8 a.m. Imagine VDI infrastructure starting to impact my production environment at 8 a.m., 9 a.m. in the morning that's sharing the same maybe virtualized servers that are processing payroll or whatnot, right? All on the same kind of infrastructure. This creates some serious unhappy customers and really some serious performance bottlenecks. The other thing that we look at too here is when you're running whether it's a public cloud or your own private cloud environment, when you look at the evolution, most likely the private cloud will be the next journey that you look at. Those virtual machines in the traditional approach, if they're getting updates from their antivirus client, things of that nature, they're going to be spinning up and they're going to receive those signatures in the latest rule sets. And they're going to have to call into either a localized server or go out to the cloud and get it. Both have multiple hybrid models. That's going to create that resource constraint. Well, the other thing that's concerning is what happens when you have to spin some of those machines down. I've had to do this, right? You start running out of resources because you're piling on a lot of servers, a lot of infrastructure, and at some point in time, maybe you spin a development machine down, right? Your developers are doing something. I don't need that anymore, it's R&D, but it's residing on my virtualized infrastructure, my physical host. What happens when you spin that down? It goes dormant. The longer that stays down, could be days, could be weeks, could be months, what's happening to that particular machine?
Becoming outdated.
It's becoming outdated on a number of fronts. Antivirus, if there's using a HIPS, which is host intrusion prevention system, or a firewall to protect that virtual machine, if it's a server or even a virtual desktop infrastructure, rule sets associated with zero-day type of attacks or web application attacks are going to be outdated as well. What happens when they come back up? They're going to want to do what? Call out to the mothership and get updated. See my comment about resource constraints. It's going to start creating a bottleneck on you, okay? Think about that when you're deploying a virtualization strategy and you're wrapping security around that. Inter-VM attacks. I brought up something over lunch, public cloud centric, but equally important in a multi-tenant fashion or even a private cloud of your own internally, is we still have to be cognizant of those virtual machines that you're deploying in a cloud ecosystem potentially being compromised through maybe nobody's fault of their own, through some vulnerability that then allows that system to have the persistence of a miscreant on it. He or she may then what they want to try to do is then move laterally across your organization, across your networks, right? What else can I knock down that I'm in and I'm on your IP network? That command control server, what else can I go knock down? Well, in a virtualization world, you're going to have inter-VM attacks with that. And the interesting thing around traditional technologies is they don't often look into the virtual switch of like a VMware, which is the leading hypervisor, to see what the inter-VM communications are doing. So you've got to look at technologies that can look across that hypervisor, not only and see what's going on with the virtual machines, but also be able to understand the integrity of the hypervisor itself. Because who in here knows that if the hypervisor tips over and is compromised, it's game over. It's game over, okay? Now, a lot of those technologies certainly have been immune to that at this point in time, but you've got to be able to find other technologies that can look at that hypervisor and do a trust but verify of, okay, nothing's trying to attempt to compromise or has compromised that hypervisor, because then the rest is game over. So looking at those things that are inter-VM attacks and across the virtual switch is also very, very important. So what's the new way of thinking around this cloud-centric data center model of incorporating speed, flexibility, agility, but not sacrificing security, right? And ultimately finding where you can get the proverbial ROI, which is also very important in limited resources and budget times, right? The old way is you're throwing, for every kind of security protocol, whether it's antivirus, whether it's intrusion prevention, whether it's file integrity monitoring, you're putting what on that particular physical machine, or worse, on the virtual machine. What are you putting on that? An agent, okay? An agent. Well, we started thinking with our relationship with VMware, there's got to be a better way of doing that so you don't have to constantly load up agents on virtual machines, because that completely defeats the purpose of virtualizing, right? So leveraging technologies that can get hypercentric, hypervisor-centric specific to give you the security and the protocols you need, because all those agents are going to add up and they're going to cause you problems the more you start to scale your environments. Seen it, been there, done it, felt the pain, okay? Think about it now, plan about it, plan for it. So where do you want to go? You want to go agentless. How can I get that same level of protection that typically requires an agent to hook into my kernel on that particular software-defined asset? How can I do that at a layer up at the hypervisor so I can streamline my resources, get more density on those boxes? Because you're going to be spinning up machines left and right, whether that's VDIs or servers. Plan for it so you can prolong hardware expenses, get more, do more with less, and prolong software expenses. Because I will tell you this, it doesn't matter if it's Microsoft, VMware, whatever, the more RAM you consume and CPUs you consume to put those virtual machines on, the more it's going to cost you money. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. But in particular, those resources are going to start costing you money the more you spin up. Don't sacrifice that cost because of an approach to doing security. Save that for business-critical services that need to come up and servers that need to be coming up over the long haul that don't necessarily have to be all bogged down with security-related products. Okay? So wrapping those all up, if you look at the physical virtual cloud paradigm, the other thing you're going to want to do is to be able to manage that simply, right? Because if I have to go to a lot of different places to manage a variety of different products and a lot of different vendors to go do that, do I really have the staff to keep up with that? I don't. I don't. So it has to be something that the operations team, so the infrastructure folks, and the security operations, if you have a security operations group, or even just the overhead of a compliance team that's saying, we have to do this for these state regulations or these particular federal regulations, they can all get happy because it's really embedded in the security development lifecycle. As these spin up, they're embedded with this wrapper, and it's done at a very, very consistent, clear, concise level. All right? I think we pretty much talked through the different cloud models and the importance of this, but one platform with an integrated approach that gives you a streamlined management console for antivirus, deep packet inspection, compliance, file integrity, log management. There's not one single silver bullet, but the more you can consolidate a platform and manage it within one, and you get best of breed kind of capability, and you save time and money, you need to be looking for those types of capabilities and those kinds of vendors. So in our survey, what did we find out was holding back those particular vendors? And then I'm going to wrap up, and we'll spend the last 10, 15 minutes talking with our case study. Two things. It better perform, right? That's the concern, is I don't want to move something outside of my four walls that gives me less service. Two, my data is sacred. I got to know that my data is protected. Hence, service level agreements. How do you prevent breaches? What do you do if breaches happen? All right? Got to focus on all that. All right? Multi-tenancy. One of the other things that we strongly encourage is where you can, encrypt data. Encrypt your volumes that VMs touch, whether they're in your four walls or in the cloud, and you manage the keys. So you have miscreants that can't get in because it's encrypted and they don't have the keys, number one. Two, if you have multi-tenancy issues and you're in Amazon and whatnot, they can't access your data because they don't have the keys. Either way, okay? The other thing that people have a concern of, where is my data residing? Is it here? Is it in Europe? Where is this data striped across these cloud infrastructure providers? Well, look at technologies that encrypt so you don't care. And also, you don't care if they pull out drives and may have remnants of your data on there. You don't care because that data is useless to other people because it's encrypted and again, you have the keys. Protect it. Create self-defending workloads. And that's the data destruction I just talked about. What I like to do now is talk about, the journey that one of our customers has gone down the route. And it's really a strong journey that I know very, very well, and that's the PCI Compliance realm. And taking their physical world that they know today, looking at a strategy and ultimately a plan and a roadmap for moving from physical to virtual, but then providing the capability to where they can do that in a cost-effective manner and one that isn't going to cripple their operations while they're supporting this compliance initiative. Finding ways to do more with more is what I've been talking about, more with more. So that being said, I'd like to introduce a couple folks from the city of Fresno. Brian Horn and Rob Barnes are ultimately the ones that are taking on this initiative for the city. And they're going to talk about what phase they are in the journey, the business problem, the challenge that they faced, and then ultimately give you kind of an overview in the next 10 minutes or so around why they chose the particular platform they did and ultimately why they arrived at that particular conclusion. So I'll ask these gentlemen to come up and maybe give a quick summary of the business challenge and then ultimately how you mapped a solution set to that particular business challenge. So, gentlemen.
We really started out really on the physical front. The virtualization is really where we're going, but our PCI journey, we had a lot of challenges on the physical end, and we got introduced to Trend. We're a current customer with their antivirus product, and there were a lot of challenges we needed to meet on the endpoint. Host intrusion protection, file integrity monitoring, centralized logging, things along those lines. And we got tied into deep security, and how should I say, luckily we were able to afford to buy a couple of virtualization licenses, which we've been learning with. But we're able to manage everything from a single point, whether it's our virtual environment or our in-client. It's been a very good platform for us to start with, and it has a lot of room for growth.
Excellent. When you were looking at the overall PCI compliance and trying to figure out, okay, what are the key things we need to deploy initially, right, that gets us down from a merchant perspective and ultimately the assurances that you're protecting that cardholder information, what were the key pieces of functionality you were looking for in order to be able to hit that PCI compliance marker, initially knowing that it was going to be a journey, right?
Well, I mentioned a few points that we identified right up front. The file integrity, the log monitoring, things along those lines. But we also wanted something that we're familiar with. We're already familiar with Trend's consoles. We're already familiar with Trend as a company. We have, a lot already invested. So it's kind of a natural route for us to go down.
Excellent. One of the other things too, from a PCI compliance standpoint, that I think is a real challenge when you're dealing with custom web applications is protecting against SQL injection vulnerabilities. And often, if you look at the PCI spec, that basically talks about web application protection or a web application firewall. These are critical things you have to have, or the alternative is you need to have a third party review your code line by line and sign off on it to ensure that it's protected, okay? So it's an either or, and some people have the resources to be able to do both,
But I'm really curious to hear about you guys' thoughts around web application protection and some of the things in deep security that you found beneficial to be able to secure your particular environment.
Well, the biggest thing, we have two separate PCI environments that are client server based, SQL backend, web front end. And deep security has the tools to basically put it in a discovery mode, to be able to monitor and be able to trend it.
No pun intended.
Well, it made it a lot easier for us to develop rule sets with a relatively small IT staff.
Great. So one of the capabilities he's talking about really is this this tap mode, right? So where you can look at traffic and inspect traffic and ultimately learn what's going on with the way you're either scanning your own applications to see where vulnerabilities are, or potentially where the miscreants are trying to find it. You can look at that in kind of a tap mode, but then immediately you can move that into a block mode, where if somebody's trying to do SQL injection in your environment, whether it's an agentless deployment and we're doing it at the hypervisor layer, or an agent deployment where it's on a physical machine or it's running in the cloud, you can do a TCP/IP reset on that packet and say, go away because you're trying to say select star from, or do some kind of SQL injection because I don't have input validation on my particular web application. So it really streamlines the protection and continuous monitoring standpoint and does the heavy lifting for you at the host based, again, back to that self-defending component. So I think we've got a couple more minutes. One of the things I'd like to say is a couple parting shots for you guys. If you had one or two key things that you would say, either lessons learned or you're looking to take advantage of as you journey through the cloud and PCI compliance, what would be a couple of things that you would leave with these folks today to consider?
The lessons learned really on the virtualization side is just not very many companies are dealing with the hypervisor level like deep security is. And one of our lessons learned is just really keeping track of the compatibility. We had the virtual appliance in place, and another group came in and updated some of the VMware files, and all of a sudden we ended up with little incompatibility. So just really make sure that, as you start working on things like this, that make sure the two groups are communicating, the people supporting the virtual servers and the people working on security, to make sure that the updates are playing well and that the versions are compatible. And in our case, now those groups have to work together to make sure that when we're doing VMware upgrades, we're also doing trend upgrades and keeping things at similar levels.
Brian, do you have any things that you'd want to mention to these folks?
Yeah, make it a team approach. We had a lot of network people who were working on this, as well as some of the desktop engineers. And some of the desktop engineers really didn't see what we were doing, and they didn't have an idea of where we were going. So we kind of brought the team together and expanded the team from a couple of network engineers to bring the desktop involved. And it kind of opened their eyes, and they went back to their teams and said, hey guys, we've got to do all these specifications for PCI compliance. And so it opens their eyes. Make it a big team approach so that the team also has ownership in it, because if you have that, you're going to be more successful as well.
The one thing I'd add on that is make sure your constituents or your key users are involved as well, because even though you're able to do a lot of the testing stuff in the tap mode, once you start applying the rules, regardless of how close you've looked at them, you're going to break things. And just make sure you have that relationship so that when you do turn on a new rule and it does break something, that they come to you and say, hey, this isn't working, versus they're kind of yelling and screaming with a gun.
Yeah, you can get yourself into trouble if you want to in deep security, because you can tighten up as much as you want. And we've had to lessen the load a little bit and back off a little bit from it. So.
That's great. No, I appreciate it. Any other comments? And maybe we'd open up for a couple questions while we got a couple minutes left, and see if the crowd has any comments or questions for us. What do you guys think? Any questions about anything we've talked about? I know it's a quick fire hose of information, and certainly didn't get into a lot of the key components and the intricacies of the product suite, which is not what we're here for today. But ultimately, if you have any other questions around the product or the capabilities to secure your journey to the cloud and what we can do, hit me after this presentation. We're here the rest of the afternoon. Leslie Ross in the back is the account executive for the state, and she has a tremendous amount of resources at her disposal to get you more information, including trials of this particular product as well. So not a full-blown product pitch at all today, but more around things to consider when you start looking at securing your journey to the cloud and cloud adoption. So thank you very much for your time today. Have a great rest of the conference, and we'll be talking to you soon. Thank you.